So until under current conditions, Gaza becomes Denmark, that's when this can end. Like, it's just, you've set an it's an obvious recipe for forever war.
What are our interests in Ukraine? Explain this to me, please. I haven't figured it out. And oh, by the way, what driving strategic interest compels us to support the Israeli extermination of people in Gaza?
Dave Smith and Douglas Macgregor just exposed foreign wars, military operations, and regime change efforts for bankrupting America. And in this clip, they talk about how this policy undermines U.S. national security and how the propaganda regime keeps these things propped up long after they're popular with the American populace. So let's get right into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
I mean, there seems to be no onus to even demonstrate, like, for example, with those boats off the coast of Venezuela, that they were drug dealers or they had drugs or they were on their way to us. Venezuela is not even one of the major contributors to our drug problem here. It's much more Colombia, Mexico, China. There's lots of other, it doesn't even make sense. And then, of course, as you know, led by the head of the State Department right now, Marco Rubio, there's been a major effort to flirt with a regime change in Venezuela that seems to be kicking up again.
Yeah, how many times do we have to play this film about regime change to discover that it's a dead end? It doesn't work. It leads you nowhere. This really goes back to the Bolsheviks. Once they took power in Moscow, they had this notion of perpetual revolution. They were going to march all the way across Europe and install new communist parties in power everywhere. Didn't work out. And it brought on the Second World War, frankly. I think we have to step back and ask ourselves, what are our real problems and what are the threats against us that we should be concerned about? I can't find existential threats beyond our borders. I'm sorry, I just don't see them. I see no evidence for mendacity and determination to attack and destroy us or Europe on the part of Moscow. Absolutely not. Yeah. Completely disinterested in that over there. The Chinese, how do you persuade people that Xi is not the evil Fu Manchu, that he actually wakes up every morning and hopes that he can hold 1.4 billion people together for another 24 hours? That's his top priority.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear Macgregor say this about China, as the right seems to want to agitate for war with China over Taiwan or something like that, make Taiwan a new proxy war like Ukraine is to Russia. He's right about the Bolsheviks, by the way. The concept he's talking about, worldwide revolution, was called permanent revolution. It's a theory that was latched onto by Trotsky. And inheriting that idea was many of the neocons who themselves were Trotskyites. They admit this. Irving Kristol and others say that they were Trotskyites, but just adapting this to American characteristics by saying, hey, we need to export revolution overseas, but not revolution, exporting democracy overseas. But when's the last time one of those regime change efforts ended up good for the United States? Was it in Libya, where there's slave trading now once Gaddafi got displaced and his weapons have been scattered throughout sub-Saharan Africa? Was it Syria, where now the leader is Al-Qaeda, the former emir of Al-Qaeda that founded the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, deposed because Israel wanted him to? Was it Iraq and Afghanistan, 20 years occupations, in the latter case, which replaced the Taliban with the Taliban after billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives lost over 20 years? It's so absurd, and it's so good to hear this from Macgregor.
And he spends most of his time fighting internal corruption, which is overwhelming. By the way, that's an ageless problem in China. When the Japanese invaded the place, they bought off half the Chinese and marched ashore. People don't realize that. All the bankers in Shanghai cut a deal with the Imperial Japanese Army. So the Imperial Japanese Army marched in, killed large numbers of Chinese, but they didn't touch the banks. We don't understand the reality. So I think we have to face the fact that most of the problems that we have are generated here at home by us. We create them. And the budget's a perfect example of it. We've reached a point where nobody on the Hill wants to cut a dime out of anything for fear they won't get reelected. That's not a good sign. It means that people pay attention to one thing and only one thing, the check in the mail, the freebie they get, the food stamp or something else. We've lost sight of everything else. And then you have the small group of people in Washington that enjoy these regime change wars. And effectively, the war with Iran is another regime change war waged by Israel and us. The possibility of war with Venezuela, which looks very, very real right now, unfortunately, is another regime change war. And if you go back and listen to Joe Biden and the people that surrounded him and the neocons that were advocates since, I would say easily since 2014, when we installed this puppet regime in Kiev to wage war on Russia, they've all been about regime change, at least on the surface.
Yeah, think about that. The goal ostensibly is regime change in Russia, an absurdity of mass proportions. And he's right, the U.S. installed the current regime in Ukraine in the 2014 Maidan coup, siding against the Yanukovych government, who, by the way, Yanukovych was democratically elected. For all this talk of defending democracy, the U.S. deposed him. We have recordings on voice showing Victoria Nuland talking to Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine at the time, discussing this overtly. And he's right, none of these things pay off. They're disastrous policies that shouldn't be embraced. And, you know, many Americans look the other way as long as they see things happening well domestically. But the plights that they still feel, the expenses, the debt, you know, the destruction of our civil liberties is because of the forever wars. It is because of the debt and destruction and inflation, with the central bank printing new currency to finance this madness, that we feel the frustrations we still do, despite the appearances of tranquility, which aren't true.
Obviously, they wanted to get into Russia, divide it up, strip it of its resources. The bankers were anxious to see that work so they could all get rich. We have a similar situation potentially in Venezuela. You know, Venezuela has great oil and gas, emerald mines, gold mines. Gosh, of course, it's a big problem. You see, it's almost the size of Germany and France together. It has 1,700 miles of coastline. It has 1,380 miles of border with Colombia and roughly 1,380 miles of border with Brazil. Oh, that should be easy. You know? Yeah, let's go change regime. What are you going to do with 2,000 Marines? Some special ops? And of course, the old problem with all of these things, it's the problem in the Middle East, it's the problem with Russia. What do you do when it doesn't work?
Yeah, exactly. And the regime change efforts in Venezuela are not unprecedented by Trump, by the way. In his first administration, he tried a scheme to overthrow Maduro. And this was highly documented. It was something that Tulsi Gabbard blasted at the time. And now that she's in power as the DNI, not a peep made about the prospect of overthrowing Venezuela using this recent attack, this murder by the U.S. on this ship of 11 people, saying that they are drug dealers, but not demonstrating that whatsoever, is to serve as the pretense for regime change in Venezuela. It's totally absurd. This America First administration doing that, by the way. You know, this goes back. It's such a timeless truth that at its highest level, the U.S. propaganda and empire-building propaganda is based on the theory of portraying external forces as the greatest threat to you and your country, when the truth is that the enemy is within our gates. It is the U.S. government that supports this nonsense to drive a wedge between peoples by encouraging a culture war, why they launch forever wars and fund the largest corporations in the world like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and JP Morgan and Bank of America and Pfizer with our money. You know, this goes back to the Roman Republic, where Cato said, you know, Caesar's making all these inroads against, you know, the barbarian hordes, the Gauls, right? But really, he is the biggest threat to the Republic. The Gauls are not your enemy. It's Caesar and his ambitions. The same is true in America now.
Well, historically, what have we done? Escalate until we can't, because the American people finally wake up and say that we've had enough. Get out. And that's what happened in Vietnam. Nobody talks about Vietnam anymore.
Yeah,
you don't talk about defeats, do you? Do we talk much about Iraq? I don't think so. They threw us out in 2011, and the few that stayed on, they want to get rid of them. And I think most of us have pulled out as a result. Where's the big success story in Afghanistan? How many times do you have to have strategic failure before someone inside the United States notices? And that's the biggest problem, that the American people have been insulated from all these disasters. As long as, they can go out and get a case of beer, drive home, watch the game Monday night. Hey, it's not my problem. And we have no draft, so no one feels the pain except the less than 1% that are in the armed forces. And, they're expendable. What are we worried about them for? It's a pretty terrible situation. I don't think it can go on much longer. And, I think what may rescue us, this is a terrible thing to say, but it may be bankruptcy that rescues us from ourselves.
Maybe so, and that's the road we're headed on, as both parties have no care concerning the world for spending, despite all the attention, focused on Doge and this crazy idea in hindsight that the U.S. would save $2 trillion from this organization that was going to be built around government efficiency, which, by the way, is an oxymoron, and cutting costs. It did nothing of the sort. I think they had something like $9 billion in cuts codified by Congress, which was clearly supplanted by larger debt spending adventures like the CR, the Biden level CR that Trump whipped Republicans to support. He dragged Thomas Massey for daring to oppose it on financial grounds. He passed the big abominable bill destined to make $5 trillion more in debt spending part of our reality. And we're just supposed to believe that, Republicans still stand for limited government and cutting costs. I don't buy it. Americans aren't buying this anymore, and this is the road we're on.
But we have to admit to the blame, don't we? We're Americans. We voted for this stuff. We shut up. We said nothing. We said, fine, go ahead. And we're in a mess.
Yeah. No, there is something to that. We have to take some responsibility for it. And of course, this is what Ron Paul used to always say, is that this system is fundamentally unsustainable. And so it will not sustain itself. And that end is going to come one way or the other. And then I think the question is, what do we do with that? And what is the response to that? As you said, as you were talking about this, I'm thinking, I had mentioned this on my last show, but so recently on Piers Morgan, he had a panel where there was one of our mutual good friends, Scott Horton, was on, and your old colleague, General Wesley Clark, was on the show too. And there was one point where it was the end of the show. So like Wesley Clark made this point, and then Scott didn't get around to respond to it. But I found it like truly striking. At one point, Scott was condemning Donald Trump's support for Israel's destruction of Gaza. And then General Wesley Clark said once at the end, he said, yeah, but what's the alternative? What does Israel pull out now and let Hamas say that they won? And I was really taken back by that I went, so you, like at this point that Mr. former 4-star general, you still have not learned the lesson of, like, yes, that is, I mean, okay, technically that is true. And I guess that is one of the bad parts of fighting an occupation war where there's an insurgency and eventually you can't beat the insurgency. Yeah, all they have to do is not lose, and then they get to say that they won. But that applies to Afghanistan. That applied to Vietnam. That applies to, yes, but essentially the thing that's so frustrating about it is that obviously, if you just think about this, what the situation, the corner that you're painting yourself into now is saying, what, you can't leave until what? There's not one young man with a rifle who wishes to avenge his cousin or father or son or until none of that. So until under current conditions, Gaza becomes Denmark, that's when this can end. Like, it's just, you've set it's an obvious recipe for forever war.
This is exactly right. What a great point here, but that is what it is under those justifications that we can't end global conflicts, global wars, military operations, regime change efforts, is that it will allow the enemy to present a victory. That's the concern. It's not the thousands of American troops dead, trillions of dollars in defense spending, which is really war spending and empire building. that's your concern, this is the boondoggle you get into with the war machine and with empire building experiments that Ron Paul always warned against, that Thomas Jefferson always warned against, George Washington always warned against. This is presenting a propaganda scheme to present forever wars. And if we followed that line of reasoning, the U.S. would still be occupying Afghanistan. And it is why the U.S. is still occupying Iraq. There's still only about 1,000 troops there, but that is happening. That's still why large portions of Syria are occupied by the United States. It'll allow ISIS to proclaim victory. It's so stupid and backward and doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And they'll always use any excuse under the sun to keep those conflicts going, keep the money flowing into Lockheed Martin, but we have had enough with this war regime.
And it's shocking to me that somebody who, like, look, I don't agree with Wesley Clark on a lot of things. He's a Democrat, and I don't agree with his politics. But you would think that here's a guy who was like the leader of the NATO forces, a 4-star general, a guy who's got to have, like a head on his shoulders. And it was just stunning to me to hear that you're still working within this paradigm that means we bleed ourselves into bankruptcy and your boys get slaughtered, like the ones you're supposed to be responsible for. It's just, I guess the question is more like, how are more people in the military not able to see the things that you're able to see, I guess, is the question.
I think a lot of the trouble starts at West Point because you go to a mixer. In the old days, we were all male, and they would bus in these girls from all over the place. And somebody would walk in and say, well, I'm not really very impressed and everything else. Somebody said, here's a beer. Put your beer goggles on. And after enough beers, suddenly everything looks really good.
What a comparison, man. But I guess that is what they're doing with these foreign wars. They're making them look better than they are after lots of propaganda, which I guess is symbolized by the beer in his allegory. But what an interesting thing for him to say there.
I think Wes Clark, by the way, I know him and I like him personally very much. He's a very intelligent man. He and I always got along well, though we did not agree on a lot of things. But to his credit, he tolerated me when I disagreed with him. I think because he knew I would always be honest with him and I would be loyal to him, and I have been and I will be. But he was wounded, almost died in Vietnam. They had to fly him on an emergency basis all the way to Japan. And they thought they were going to lose him on the table. His wife flew into Japan, and it was almost nothing short of a miracle that he survived. And so you would think, in retrospect, as you reflect on that you would question exactly what you brought up. But it's deeply ingrained in him, this idea, well, you have to win. We haven't won anything for a very, very long time. And we forget how terrible the Second World War was. I listen to people like, well, we won the Second World War. Well, actually, 50 plus million people died in it. We happened to be on the winning side, but we were all really, really happy we came in late, and we were really, really happy when we only fought for about 3 years and it was over.
Yeah, World War II was not a glorious victory by any stretch, and it's certainly not the best scenario that could have unfolded in that time for 50 million people to die. I think the majority, or at least the plurality of which were Russian, by the way. But he's right, we haven't won a modicum of things based on our current military misadventures. So what makes you think that we're giving up win conditions if we don't pursue this path? If we actually embrace peace? There's nothing in the world that would say that. Everything's full of false victories, if that. If you're saying like the 12-day war was a victory against Iran, despite the fact it looks like they have their nuclear weapons program intact, they'll probably have every incentive now to actually produce a nuclear weapon now. And I would, by the way, just like North Korea did. The U.S. doesn't put regime change on the table with North Korea anymore. If you're going to portray that we had a victory in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya and Syria, it's just a retarded mentality. Forgive the French, but that's the truth. There is no winning in the current foreign policy avenue. That does not produce wins, despite all the rhetoric that, we won't be able to win if we discard this mentality and these policies.
And we don't want to go back there and experience it again. but that's not what you hear. I'm so glad the president was tough and told those Russians to get with the program. What? Have you lost your mind? This is a sovereign state. It has its own national security interests. They're legitimate security interests. What's wrong with treating them as legitimate security interests? They don't have any interest to compare to ours. Well, what are our interests in Ukraine? Explain this to me, please. I haven't figured it out. And oh, by the way, what driving strategic interest compels us to support the Israeli extermination of people in Gaza? I don't get it. Now, you may not like the people in Gaza. That's fine. And the Israelis, it's their country, obviously, if they want to do these things. But what are we doing supporting it? Is that consistent with our values? I hear all this crap all the time about, well, our values dictate. Okay, what are those? Mass murder and expulsion? Where's that on the list? I don't see it.
Yeah, man, I don't see it either. Well said there at the end by Macgregor, too. Ukraine is not in the U.S. interest. This proxy war against a nuclear power. We should be friends with Russia, trade with Russia, not try to antagonize them. Country sitting on the biggest stockpile of nuclear weapons. Are you kidding me? That's insane. And just looking the other way at Netanyahu's genocide in Gaza, supported by the right-wing Likudniks, that Trump has leverage over ostensibly if he wanted to use it, but he doesn't because he's too controlled by the Israel lobby. So is Marco Rubio, the preeminent Zionist neocon, Mike Huckabee, our ambassador to Israel. Are you kidding me? One of the most rigid, fierce, and ardent Zionists in the country. This is the regime we get when we defer to Israel first. And thankfully, more and more people on the right are waking up to it. Macgregor's been talking about it a long time. Dave Smith is, but in Congress we have Marjorie Taylor Greene, and we have, Thomas Massey. Pundits on the right like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson are speaking truth to power on this regard too. And man, I'm here for it. I think this is a really good, sea change that we're seeing. Now, I don't think it will manifest into political changes in diminishing the power of AIPAC and the Israel lobby anytime soon, but I do think there's a real chance of that happening within, say, 10 years as younger people shift away. Every single poll shows how many people that are younger are just discarding this mentality that their fathers and their fathers' fathers embraced regarding the Israel first mentality, because as a generality, that is true. Older people are much more likely to support Israel than younger people. But nothing can happen in one day. But I do think that's why the Israeli regime is just so desperate to consummate the Greater Israel Project right now. Try to take out and destabilize all its neighbors and expand its borders now while they have the time and ostensible support from the United States for at least the next decade. But we'll have to see what happens after that. I do want to hear from what you guys have to say, though. Are foreign wars and military operations and regime change efforts bankrupting the United States? Are Dave Smith and Douglas Macgregor right? Let me know down in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Dave Smith. He's awesome. Great interview here. Love to say that Dave Smith's my friend, and happy to see how much he's succeeding. And if you like this commentary in my video, please support my channel by clicking the join button below. You can help support the channel, which would mean the world to me, and I really appreciate it if you go that length to support me. But I'll also give you the gift in return of getting access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.